Hello everyone. It's really lovely to be speaking at the Inclusion in Action conference. I'm speaking to you today from University of Southampton on the south coast of England. I wish I was with you in Cork, but that wasn't possible. So this is the next best thing. I've given myself a really long and complex title for my talk. I don't know why I did that, but anyway, the talk is about what can inclusive research and inclusive education for students with intellectual disabilities in higher education learn from each other. So there's a lot in that. Fortunately, I've got a slide here that breaks it down a little bit, that says, what I'm gives you an overview, a preview, if you like, of what my talk is going to be about. And it's about the thought and belief behind action. Inclusion in action doesn't just suddenly be, there's a lot of thought and belief behind it. So that's one strand. I'm going to say a little bit about what inclusive education means so that we are all on the same page. I'll say something about what inclusive research means. And then as I get to the meat of it all, how some of the thought and the belief behind inclusive education and inclusive research are similar. They're similar, but I'm going to argue they haven't always spoken to each other or learned as much from each other as maybe they could. So I'm all for learning from each other. So what can inclusive education and inclusive research learn from each other? There's a really wonderful book, I think an edited book by Patricia O'Brien and colleagues, including Roger Slee, about inclusion in higher education. And they have 4 sections. I'm looking at my notes now to remind myself the 4 sections. Philosophical, theoretical, and rights-based framework of inclusion, that's 1. Evidence-based outcomes from inclusion in HE. The lived experience of being and becoming a university student for people with intellectual disabilities. And fourthly and lastly, critical issues associated with the development of inclusion in this post-secondary higher education sector. So of those 4 sections, I'm only going to be talking about the first one and the 4th one. And this is because you there at the conference, I think, are much more in the world of the middle two, what are the outcomes of making this happen and what's the lived experience. You're the experts on that. What I can do and what I can offer the conference is some of these ideas and theoretical beliefs and critical kind of associations between ideas. So that's my little preview. First of all, though, I'm going to give you some introduction. So an introduction to me, that's not me in the photo, by the way. That's 2 people interacting and thinking and being together. But I may be a professor at the University of Southampton now, but I started off my career as a teacher in a school with adults with intellectual disabilities set within a long stay institution. And it was as a young, new, naive maybe, possibly, teacher, that I just began to question everything. I went into a situation where they used an approach which was very behaviourist, and in a behaviourist approach, the thinking is that people with intellectual disabilities are kind of mouldable. People are kind of plastic in our hands, and we can shape them to be better, more educated, more skilled people by the way that we interact with their behaviours, a bit like how you train a dog, if I'm honest, and that's awful. But as a young teacher, I said, I don't believe that we should be treating people with intellectual disabilities as objects that we shape and do things to. I believe in their basic humanity, and that they are fundamentally, you, people in the audience, are fundamentally social human beings. And thinking differently about people with intellectual disabilities meant that I acted differently. I wasn't willing to use a behaviourist approach, but I had to find something else instead. And that's kind of underpinned my whole career from when I was 22 onwards. Thinking differently, acting differently. And this little diagram on my next slide really tries to sum up that what we know, what we believe, what we do, these all interact with each other in fundamental ways, which is why, although the theme for the conference is action, I'm not just talking about action, I'm talking about this other stuff as well. I wrote a paper some time back and it was for, sip of water. It was for an Irish journal, actually, Reach, and it was called Thinking Inclusively, Acting Inclusively, Researching Inclusively. And it was really pulling out the interrelationship between these three dimensions. At another point, I wrote another paper, that's what I like doing, and that was called Inclusive Research and Inclusive Education, why connecting them makes sense for teachers and learners, democratic development of education. You can see I'm a fan of a long title. But in that paper, I argued some of the things I'm going to argue in this talk today. So if you've read that paper, you might think you can switch off now, which maybe you can, but I'm also challenging myself in this talk to begin to apply some of what I was thinking then and have been thinking about a lot to the sphere of higher education. I hope this is a higher education institution in the photograph that some of you in Cork will recognise. So, while I've worked with people with intellectual disabilities for 4 decades, and worked in higher education as a researcher for 3 decades, I'm not been one of the people at the forefront of the movement to bring people with intellectual disabilities into higher education. And I've been reflecting on why I'm not one of those people. But anyway, I'm not. Those people are there in the conference. You can talk to those people. They're all around you. And I so wish I was there and able to talk with you too. But where I come in is I'm somebody who loves playing with ideas, pushing at boundaries, making connections between ideas. I'm a methodologist and an educationalist and somebody who works in disability studies. So I'm bringing ideas across boundaries all of the time. And I hope I'm doing that in ways that make a difference to people's lives. So I'm thinking some fresh thoughts for this conference around things I've thought about a lot, but in relation to higher education. So this next part, I'm going to start thinking about these relationships between what we think, what we do, what we believe, and thinking about them in the context of this conference. When I'm talking about all of this, I'm reflecting on moments in my life that have changed me. I spoke about my starting career. Some books have changed me along the way, have changed what I believe, changed what I think, and one of them is Learning Without Limits, which is on your slide now. This book isn't about people with intellectual disabilities. This book is about how we organise teaching and learning. And it's fascinating how they did the research, actually, Susan Hart and colleagues. They didn't believe in the 11+ system, which we have in the UK where people take a test when they're aged 11, or they used to, some places they still do, and it divides them into academic learners and non-academic learners, and then they go off into different schools, grammar schools or comprehensive schools or secondary modern schools as it used to be. And what the authors involved in this project did was advertise in the Times Educational Supplement in a newspaper for other teachers who didn't believe that we should be thinking about learners as either one thing or the other and acting forevermore based on that fundamental belief that there are two sorts of learners. And they had people come through and they have fascinating discussions with people about their beliefs and why they didn't believe that you should be able to set limits on what you expect of learners based on one kind of assessment or one view of them. But interestingly, what they also did was go into those classrooms. So 9 teachers who believed that we should be learning without limits being put on us, invited the researchers into their classrooms to see the connection between what they thought and believed and how they acted as teachers and what went on in their classrooms. I find this fascinating as a way of doing things. And together the teachers and the learners who kind of pulled all these chapters together in this book, they realised really that the thinking and the action cohered around 3 fundamental principles. And these are the principles of co-agency, which we can think of, if we're being a bit more easy read about it, as doing education together. You know, it's not, if we're going to have an inclusive classroom, then that's not in the gift of the teacher. It's not in the gift of the students, it's in what they do together to make that classroom inclusive. That was one of the principles. Another principle was around working for everybody. We're doing inclusive education because we're in it together. This isn't just for the benefit of some of the students in the class, this is for the benefit of all students in the class, so we're in it together. And the third principle was around trusting the learner. And these teachers were saying, we can't do it alone. We need each other. Teachers and learners need each other if we're going to be inclusive. So these ideas, I think, have been formative for me, and I hope they can be ideas that you can reflect on during the conference. It's not only books, though, that influence our thinking, is it? It's moments, it's things, people we talk to and experiences we have. And when I'm talking to my own students in higher education now, I often talk about my Mabel Cooper moments. So let me introduce you to Mabel Cooper. This lovely photograph of her on the left comes from her obituary. Sadly, she's no longer with us. And the rather blurry photograph of her with Dorothy Atkinson is when she got her honorary doctorate at the Open University. But neither of those were my Mabel Cooper moment. Let me tell you about my moment. So it's going back in time again. We're back in 2001. I'm not a young teacher anymore, but I'm a young-ish higher education lecturer. I'm at a conference at the Open University on testimonies of resistance in learning disability history. Intellectual disability history, you'd think of it, perhaps. This is an unusual kind of conference. It's quite radical because the Social History of Learning Disabilities group at the OU believe in doing things inclusively. So the conference has speakers and audiences and chair people, some with intellectual disabilities, some without. Great kind of diversity in what they're doing. Nonetheless, my moment happened when an academic was on the podium and giving a presentation on her research, not inclusive research on this occasion, but on her archival historical research going back through archives, on education in a long-stay institution, one of the old hospital institutions for people with intellectual disabilities. And she's presenting her findings, she's got photographs, it's all very interesting. And then I look across as an older woman with intellectual disabilities, Mabel Cooper, puts up her hand and says, points out, "Sorry, but you're wrong." And I leave that moment's pause there, because there was a pause in the conference as I remember it. Jan was there, she might remember this moment too. A pause, hang on, this is uncomfortable. A person with intellectual disabilities is challenging this academic and saying that they're wrong. And Mabel went on to explain that she'd lived for many years in a long-stay institution, and the things that the academic was talking about were things that they brought out when they had VIPs, special people came into the institutions. They brought out all these educational artifacts, and the other days these things weren't there. That moment and that lesson has always stayed with me, because it was a moment where you have to actually stop and think. In research terms, we call these critical incidents. And sometimes you do a whole kind of research around a critical incident. And it was a critical incident, a stop and think moment, where we had to stop and think, who knows? Who knows best? How do we know? And it's not that everything the academic was saying was wrong, and that Mabel could speak for all institutions and everybody and what went on. It was a moment when you realised that we needed to have dialogue, that we can understand something better when people with intellectual disabilities and academics work and talk and interact and have dialogue together. So this, for me, it's kind of informed everything that I understand and hold dear about inclusive research. So what do we mean by inclusive research? Again, I'm citing Jan, who's with you at the conference, and Kelly Johnson, and their work in this book about inclusive research for people with learning disabilities. They tried to define then, and they've worked further and amended this definition, but they haven't taken away from these things. When we do inclusive research, we're doing research that's relevant to people with intellectual disabilities, that matters to them, that benefits them, that speaks of their views, your views, and treats you with respect. Okay, so these are quite key kind of things, quite different to how research maybe is ordinarily done. So it takes people with intellectual disabilities away from being the object of the research, or maybe giving some data for the research, and actually involves people in making decisions, conducting interviews, thinking about the ideas, writing the papers, presenting them at conferences like this, so that you don't just have to hear from people like me. Other people have contributed ideas about what's really important about inclusive research. I'm one of those people, but there are many people. So it begins to bring in ideas about shared control over research, mutual respect, co-learning, and standing alongside people with intellectual disabilities as we do research that's in some way socially just, and it changes the relationship between the researcher and the researched. It brings about dialogue. And this is critical, and I want us all to understand that this is what we're meaning when we're talking about inclusive research. Of course, most research goes on, or a lot of research goes on in the academy, in higher education, not all of it. And some of what inclusive research has done is taken research out of higher education institutions, or taken people with intellectual disabilities into higher education institutions. And that's very interesting, what happens when we begin to do that. So I've kind of explained what I mean by that. I'm now going to kind of explain as best as I can in a few moments what we mean by inclusive education. And here we are talking about organising teaching and learning so that people learn together, so that it's fair, so that it responds to the needs of all. And I'm hoping you can spot some echoes there, some connections between inclusive research and inclusive education. I'm rather fascinated by, in inclusive research, there are all these different terms to mean very similar things. Democratic dialogue, collaborative research, co-research, people-led research, disability-led research, emancipatory research, participatory research. Sorry, I'm throwing a lot of terms at you, but the key thing is we have a lot of words to describe the same thing. There's something quite different happening with inclusive education because we tend to use this one term and we use it to mean all different things. So it's the opposite, if you like. Melane's written about this and written about sometimes when we talk about inclusive education, we're talking about disability, special educational needs. Sometimes we're talking about behaviour and getting rid of exclusions for students on the basis of their behaviour. Sometimes we're talking about all groups vulnerable to exclusion, so girls, minority ethnic groups, gypsies, Romanis, etc. Sometimes we're talking about the promotion of a school for all, and sometimes we're talking about education for all, as in the UNESCO Global Challenges and Priorities. So inclusive education can mean all different things, but it has a lot in common, I would argue, with inclusive research when we think about the values and the beliefs behind it. So one observation is that the whole kind of bulk of literature about inclusive education, most of it is about the school sector, where we've traditionally had mainstream schools and other. Higher education, when we think about that, we need to think a little bit differently because higher education has never really been for all. It has always been a kind of elitist, hierarchical thing for some, and it's only in some countries in the global north more recently that we've had a widening participation agenda, bringing more people into higher education. And it's more recently still that we've even begun to think about bringing people with intellectual disabilities into higher education. So some old ideas and some new contexts and fresh challenges, I suggest. Okay. So I'm now moving on to my bit of my talk about what they've got in common. And I've just put these slides up so that you're not just looking at words, and hopefully some of these images may be a bit more inclusive for you as well. These images all come from bits of work I've done. They could come from inclusive research. They could come from inclusive education. In fact, they kind of apply to both concepts. And they indicate that sometimes when we're thinking about doing research inclusively or doing education inclusively, we begin to break some boundaries, do things differently, think freshly, act freshly. But I'm going to share with you now 3 core ideas that I think bring inclusive education and inclusive research closer together. One is that they're both about perhaps a journey from exclusion to inclusion, from bringing people who've been on the outside inside something. That's one key idea. Another is that we can think of a continuum, a kind of process, staged process of approaches in inclusive research or inclusive education. And these processes might take us through co-option, compliance, consultation, cooperation, co-learning, collective action. Lots of wonderful words beginning with C. And my third point that kind of links the two together is that although we can think about a journey and we can think about stages along that journey, some people in both spheres also highlight for us that this is something we can think about this as something much more radical, much more jumping off of the edge of the cliff into something new. Michael Oliver wrote about this when he was writing about emancipatory research as opposed to participatory research. He was writing about we can change the rules of the game to bring more people in and involve them, or we can do something more radical and change the game altogether. And he, you know, obviously he was advocating something more radical. There's a really strong echo of this in inclusive education. So for a lot of people, integration, the old idea, is about schools, higher education institutions, whatever, staying the same, and we integrate people with intellectual disabilities as and when they're ready to fit in to the thing that isn't changed. And the argument is that inclusive education is radically different to inclusion, because in inclusive education what we do is say that the thing itself has to be changed. That has to be different. Not the people fitting in, but the thing that they're fitting into, or being welcomed into, or have a rightful place to belong within. Now, all of this brings us to some challenging questions. This is my moment where I make you uncomfortable, I think, and make me uncomfortable. I think we have to ask ourselves whether our efforts to make research inclusive can sometimes be about a kind of assimilation, enabling people with intellectual disabilities to think like academic researchers, to accomplish the skills of academic researchers, and therefore, and this is the important bit, not pose too much threat to academic researchers and how they do things and how they understand research should be. And the other challenging question is the education one. Are our efforts to bring people with intellectual disabilities into higher education merely tinkering at the edges of an unchanged system? Whew. I'm not expecting you to answer those questions, but I'm expecting those questions to be part of the dialogues that you're having at the conference. Now, the problem with really challenging questions like that is that they can disempower us if we're not careful. We can think, you know, what's the point of doing anything if it's never going to be enough? And this is where I bring in Margaret Mead. Margaret Mead is an acclaimed figure in our history from anthropology. And the wonderful words she said were, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And this is important for if we're feeling disempowered, that what we're doing isn't enough, that saying what we're doing is what we have to do. And it's the only thing that changes things, is if we make some inroads, we take some action, some inclusive action to make things different. Okay, I need to wrap up. And how am I going to wrap up? I can cite a couple more of my heroes because I like citing heroes. Nelson Mandela said that the most powerful weapon, if we want to change the world, is education. Okay, so let's remember that alongside Margaret Mead. We can also reflect on and remember some of the learning from Paulo Freire, a Brazilian educationalist and social change person. And Freire argued that it's not enough to bring people together. It's not even enough to bring them together to have dialogue about their social reality, which they have to have. We have to bring people together to have dialogue about their social reality so that together they can reflect on and act on the environment and the social reality to change and transform that reality. He calls this praxis or conscientiation. Doesn't matter what the fancy words are. The key thing is that we don't stop at coming together. When we come together, we reflect, we have dialogue, we begin to change things together. This is what this conference is all about. I applaud the people who've put on this conference. Well done, all of you. Okay. So I've got all sorts of argument in here. I love to get on a podium and have a good argument and spout forth and just see what people do with it all. So I argue, to sum up, that inclusive research and inclusive education, between the two of them, we should be able to make a difference. That they open up avenues for people with intellectual disabilities to become the agents of their own transformation. We're not doing things for you, people in the audience with intellectual disabilities. We're changing things so that you can become real powerful agents in all of this. And that the transformation will be greater if we really try to enjoy the benefits of inclusive research and inclusive education. I have one last slide just to plug something that's coming up in 2025, which is the journal that currently I'm still editing, the British Journal of Learning Disabilities. And in 2025, we have a special issue on the theme of people with intellectual disabilities in higher education, studying, working and researching in higher education. And the wonderful guest editors of this are the names on this slide here. I won't mangle those names, but just to say I'm sure some of them are with you for the conference. And to just flag that those papers have lots in them about beliefs, thoughts, actions around inclusion in higher education, and that special issue can be a good reference point for you, I think, going forward. On that note, I'm going to stop. Again, apologise that I'm not with you and invite questions so that at least we maybe can have a little smattering of dialogue. Thank you very much for listening.